Dear guests, welcome to today's seminar titled Environment and War, Historical Perspectives and Modern Challenges. First, a technical announcement. The seminar today will last about 1.5 hours. At the end, there will be a Q&A section where questions from the audience will be discussed. Therefore, if you have questions for our speakers, please write them down into the chat during the seminar. They will be read out at the end. As always, the seminar is being recorded and will be later published on the YouTube channel of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission. I will post the link to the channel and our partner institutions into the chat after their announcement. The languages of the webinar are English and Ukrainian. We have a simultaneous translation going. If you want to hear the translation, please click on the icon with the globe at the right bottom of the screen. Thank you for your patience. Now I pass the word on to Natalia Hanenko-Friesen.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Доброго дня всім, доброго вечора. I'm Natalia Hanenko-Friesen. I'm the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and I would like to welcome all to this second seminar of this academic year on behalf of my institution, but also our partner, German-Ukrainian Historical Commission. We have started the international webinar series immediately in the wake of the full-scale invasion by the Russian Federation of Ukraine in early 2022 after February's events. The seminar and the webinars, as we call it nowadays, is called to highlight and explore the meanings and impacts of the events which have become of global proportions, really, on the conceptions and imaginings of historical scholarship going forward, as well as, of course, reflecting on the impacts and repercussions of the events which are taken on the ground in Ukraine at the hands of the Russian Federation. We are very pleased to move on to a topic of the environmental history, and I'm very thankful to my colleague and friend Anna Olenenko for spearheading and leading this initiative. Anna Olenenko is currently affiliated with the University of Alberta. She is a regional representative of Ukraine and member of the board of the European Society for Environmental History. Anna is also co-founder of the Environmental History University of Alberta Research Group. She's a graduate of Zaporizhia National University, and she got her Candidate of Sciences in History from the National Academy of Sciences in Ukraine in 2013. Anna's research interests are related to the environmental history of Ukraine, especially the steppes region and animal studies. The latest publication is the chapter which she co-authored with Stephen Dorndell, titled In Quest of Development, Territorialization and the Transformation of the Southern Ukrainian Wetlands, 1880 through 1960, in a journal titled A New Ecological Order, Development and the Transformation of Nature in Eastern Europe, which is come in 2022 in University of Pittsburgh Press. I'm very privileged to be working with Anna at the University of Alberta. I know we're here for an important discussion. I'm thankful for my partners, but also to Anna for leading that particular area of studies globally and letting the world see how the war affects Ukraine, in particular in respect to its environments. Anna, please take it on.
Thank you so much, Natalia, and hello, everyone. I'm really grateful that I'm here today and we have the opportunity to speak to such a great and prominent speakers today. Of course, today's topic is not so easy. It's very important, but it's too hard, especially for Ukrainians, to speak about and to reflect about it. So first of all, I would like to thank you for the organizers of this Historians and War seminar series. Today's topic, environment and war, is now one of the most, I don't like this word popular, but it is a popular topic in the humanities. A lot of scholars, a lot of journalists, everybody just started to talk about the impact of war on environment, on ecosystems, etc. So we would like today to explore these topics more, and would like to give a space to our speakers to reflect on how these researchers and how the war exactly impacted their work, and how how the war impacted the research field as a whole. So the initial idea was to gather historians and scholars from different fields in humanities from different countries to talk about the connection between the war, between disasters, and environment. So we would like to talk today not only about Ukrainian cases, but also cases from Croatia. I think it is very important to talk about not only Ukraine today, because all over the world there are a lot of wars, and the situation is very similar to what is happening in Ukraine now. Also, the big part of this seminar I would like to dedicate to reflections on how these man-made disasters and how this war influenced research field, and how it influenced you, dear colleagues. So I would like to thank you, our today's speakers, my dear colleagues from Canada, Ukraine, Croatia, or other countries. I am very happy to present our speakers. I would like to present all of them at first and then give you the floor. So the first our speaker is Professor Adrian Ivakhiv. He is a Woodsworth Chair in the Humanities in Simon Fraser University, Canada. From 2003 until this year, he was a professor of environmental thought and culture at the University of Vermont, where he served as a Steven Rubinstein Professor of Environment and Natural Resources and founding coordinator of Ecoculture Lab. He previously taught at York University in Toronto and the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh. Has held fellowships at different universities, including Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv, and has conducted fieldwork on ecocultural conflicts in the US, British Isles, Western and Central Ukraine, maritime Eastern Canada, and Vermont. His books include Ecologies and the Moving Image, Cinema Affect Nature, also Shadowing the Anthropocene, Eco-Realism for Turbulent Times, and co-editor of Routledge Handbook of Ecomedia Studies, and forthcoming Terra Invicta, Ukrainian Wartime Reimaginings for a Habitat Earth and the New Lives of Images, Digital Ecologies and Anthropocene Imaginaries in the Modern Human Worlds. Our next speaker is Irina Zamuruyeva. She is an artist and an independent researcher. Through writing and photography, she explores human-environment relationship at different scales. Recently, Irina has been writing about Irina, please correct me if I pronounce it right, Adonis Vernalis. Okay, and Hurricane region, curating climate art labs, researching ecofeminism in Ukraine, exploring feminist approaches to landscape photography and militarized landscapes. In her previous fellowship at the Institute for Human Sciences, Irina researches political ecology of land relations in Ukraine, focusing on rapeseed. She works on climate and land policy at the Sustainability Charter in Scotland, and her writing has been published in different journals such as Commons, Open Democracy, Corridor, and Scottish Left Review, amongst others. The third presenter today is Hrvoje Petric, my colleague from Croatia. He's a professor of history at the University of Zagreb. He received his degrees in history from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in the University of Zagreb. where he has been employed since 2001. He is the head of the Department of History of Central and Southeastern Europe at the Department of History of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and head of the Faculty Center for Comparative Historical and Intercultural Studies. He's a member of editorial board of the Electronic Scientific Journal Arcadia, online exploration in environmental history, published by the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society and the European Society for Environmental History. His research interests includes river history, among others. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we would like to hear your thoughts about our today's topic of the seminar. Professor Ivakhiev, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I will briefly provide a kind of a big picture frame for thinking about the war in Ukraine, and I'll share my screen. Hopefully you should be seeing a full screen image of a blue and yellow field. Is that, can someone tell me?
Yeah, all is good.
Okay, excellent. All right, so my premises here come from the field of the environmental humanities, within which my work focuses on primarily on digital media, visual culture, and cultural politics, but also on theory drawing on frameworks of political ecology, world systems theory, today at least, feminist and post-colonial theory, and others. I've been thinking of my own framework for analyzing the war, the Russo-Ukrainian war, as an eco-decolonial or climate decolonial framework. And that's what I'll introduce you to in the next few minutes. Premise number one is that the Anthropocene crisis, by which I mean emergent global climate change and its accompanying ecological challenges, resource conflicts, migration crises, and political destabilizations, is causally related and in many ways marks a culmination of the global spread of colonial and extractive capitalist systems of production steered toward control and extraction of resources for economic profit, accumulation, production, and growth. While the causality behind global climate change and associated challenges is complex, I think there's value in thinking through this particular lens that I'll provide. The main effects of this spread, this globalization of extractive capitalist colonialism, have been the commodification or resourcification of the world, by which I mean the transformation of land, soil, forest, grassland, water, etc., into a productive resource. So real estate, lumber, water power, agro power, etc. The transformation of people into productive labor, and the transformation of previously untapped elements, underground minerals, fossil fuels, genetic and biological resources, electromagnetic resources, radio waves, and so on, and more recently, behavioral resources, especially online behavior, into productive resources and commodities. Secondly, the second effect is a dramatic growth in the production of goods without regard for their equitable distribution or for life cycle integrity. In other words, how or if those goods reintegrate into living ecological systems. This produces massive waste, or what economists call externalities. and it has indirectly resulted also in a dramatic growth of the human population at the expense of ecosystemic relationships. That's an image of the tar sands of Alberta. For those of you who live in Edmonton, you may be familiar with them. And thirdly, the third effect is the competitive advancement to political, economic, and military superiority of those who control or benefit from this resourcification, with the formation of a broadening wealth gap, a gap between the rich and the poor, and so on. That's premise number one. Premise number two is that these trends have had their costs and their so-called externalities, including a vast shadow side of eco-cultural trauma borne by its victims. By eco-cultural trauma, I mean the destabilization of relations between human cultural communities and the ecological environments with which they have been interdependent. This is experienced as multi-generational trauma, a loss of existential groundedness in kinship networks and territorial filiations. So with the sense of home or homeland, which is the root of the word ecology, economy, eco, from the Greek oikos, and traumatikos, a wound in that relationship between people and territory, if you will. Successive waves of colonization and exploitation have produced cultural disruption, dispossession and dislocation, enslavement, forced assimilation, and in some cases outright genocide in indigenous and traditional land-based communities across the Americas, Australasia, and large parts of Africa and Asia. And today I will focus on how this has also occurred and is occurring in Europe. This remains the overwhelming experience of climate change-related conflicts around the world today and will be in decades to come. In this sense, the trauma experienced by Ukrainians today is related to trauma experienced for generations by other people, and that will be experienced more and more, with this war being perhaps a kind of harbinger of wars to come. And in this sense, wars and conflicts today have as much of what scientists call a climate signature as do hurricanes, tsunamis, wildfires, and other extreme weather events. Where is Ukraine within this complex set of global relations? And where is this war? Well, we know that Russia is a colonial capitalist power, different from Western maritime powers because it's been primarily land-based, but still settler colonial, different also because it hasn't had at all to face the decolonization movements that most other European colonial powers have faced over recent decades, if not centuries. Russian imperial expansion to the east, north, and south involved the genocide of indigenous populations, the extraction of resources, and the consolidation of autocratic governance across perhaps the largest territorial expanse in history. Today, Russia is a klepto-capitalist state, you could say, whose future depends on continued resourcification, and particularly of underground and offshore reserves of gas and oil. And this future is poised to go away, to decline as fossil fuels are phased out. No doubt, sensing this prospective decline, Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine was a decision to reconsolidate power and to re-imperialize through conquest of what he thought would be an easy target. It was not. Ukraine's role within this has been both as a colonized territory, but also closer to the imperial core than others. So in effect, a kind of in-between or secondary status, a semi-periphery, with its rural areas constituting a colonized periphery and its urban areas more of a metropolitan semi-periphery, but marked by long-standing colonial relations. Russian historiography traces its origins to Kievan Rus, and we know all the debates about that. I can point to many other points in history, the Stalinist decimation of the intelligentsia and of peasant resistance in the Holodomor in the 1930s, a kind of two-pronged genocide, continuing Russification policies on an informal level, which go back to, of course, to the Russian imperial denial of the Ukrainian nation and language, which goes back much earlier. And then the rapid industrialization and resourcification of Ukrainian territory, the damming of the Dnipro River, the flooding of the Veliki Luch wetlands, and so on, all very relevant with the bombing last year of the Kakhovka Dam, all of which turned Ukraine into a kind of colonial resource, the USSR's, and in some sense, the world's breadbasket, as it's often called. In the last 35 years, we've seen a kind of tug of war between decolonizing and recolonizing processes. The decolonizing ideals of national self-determination, cultural revitalization, and so on, playing themselves out within a larger picture in which Ukraine's oligarchic capitalist quasi-democracy has been a form of, in some ways, neo-colonialism. And this is all very complicated. I won't get into it. The Russian recolonization effort, of course, starts quite seriously in 2014 with the takeover of Crimea, and parts of eastern Ukraine, and so on. And reconstruction after the war will also risk a kind of neo-colonialism, so it needs to be done in collaboration with Ukrainian priorities rather than becoming a form of Western, perhaps, neo-colonialism. All right, sorry, I'm a little behind on my bullet points. The elephant in the room, so to speak, in discussions of this war and its colonial imperial backdrop is the question of whether and how Russia is to decolonize. And unfortunately, I'll have to leave this question aside today, but there are many perspectives on it that need to be discussed more than they are. So I come to my conclusions, which are the prospects of environmental research and of the humanities during and after wartime. Wartime makes all scholarship difficult, if not impossible, and it leaves deep scars on people and on the land. We know how many millions of Ukrainians have left their homes. Many have left Ukraine, some have returned. Many of us here probably are all around the world. Many have lost their homes. So those deep scars are emotional, they're physical, they will continue. To expect positive outcomes from this war is a tragic absurdity. That said, the war has made Ukraine much better known to the broader world and has made Ukrainian scholars more cognizant of their role in communicating to that world, and more listened to, arguably, as well, more heard. The level of enthusiasm that I encountered when calling for work on the Terra Invicta volume that was mentioned earlier, Terra Invicta, Ukrainian Wartime Reimaginings for a Habitable Earth, which I hope will be out in the spring, was inspiring and reassuring for me. The volume will feature the writing and/or art of over 30 Ukrainians, most of them born in Ukraine, many still there, many not, with a handful like me born outside Ukraine, doing very interesting work in terms of reflecting on their position in and within this wartime situation, but also looking to a post-war future. The work that's currently being done by these and other scholars represents, in my view, a genuine wave that I think can be said to mark at least the beginnings of an environmental turn in the Ukrainian arts and humanities. And it's evident in many places. I'm sure that this turn or wave will continue as the war's effects will continue to mark and haunt the Ukrainian landscape, will continue to shape post-war economic as well as environmental and cultural policy, and will contribute to the global environmental humanities. In this sense, I think we can speak of a positive impact on scholarship, but it will need to be supported by universities and academic institutions beyond the current period. And I look forward to that and to the end of the war. And with that, I'll just thank everyone who is continuing through this difficult time, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Ivahio, for your thoughts on that topic. And then our next speaker is Irina Zamurueva. I will give you the floor, and after all speakers are done, we will start to discuss and to have a Q&A session. Okay, the floor is yours, Irina.
Super, thank you. Can you see the screen that I'm sharing? Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. Yes, just first of all, thank you so much to the organizers for putting this together. It's a great honor to be speaking in such company. Thank you to everyone who took the time out of your day to listen in. Just a quick, few words about myself, if the slide switches. There we go. So I am not a historian, but over the past 3 years or so, I've been working with various plants to explore human-environmental relations. Disciplinary-wise, most of it is practice-based work. So I am a photographer. I work with images, collage, both digital and analog, and I also write, drawing on political ecology mainly, but also environmental humanities and environmental history. And today I will share my analog photography and writing experiences that I had last year and earlier this year when I did a residency at the gallery called Street Level Photoworks in Glasgow in Scotland, which is where I'm based at the moment. And I've been working with Geranium there to study the making of militarized landscapes and also feminist approaches to landscape photography more broadly, both in Ukraine and in Scotland. And this body of work that I will be talking through, it's a series of analog images that I made during this time, but also an essay, which is forthcoming in the Environmental Humanities Journal, hopefully very soon. And I will be referring to both as I speak. So practically, first, what I've done as part of this work, I went to 2 places. Both of these are UK's Ministry of Defence sites. So the dot on the left is a firing, the dot on the right that's closer to Edinburgh, that's the firing range in the Pentland Hills, just outside the city here. And it's a place where soldiers train discharging pyrotechnics and also regularly fire actual live ammunition. And the dot on the left, so on the west side, west coast of Scotland, is Gairloch Head Hills. There, the UK MOD has not only firing ranges, but it's a strategically significant facility. You can see that it's just by the water body. And it's the Royal Navy Clyde base, which is locally in Scotland known as Fastlane. It's a home base of the nuclear submarines armed with Tridents, which are ballistic missiles launched from these submarines. So I will just read out loud a paragraph from the essay on what it, oops, that's went too far. I will read a paragraph from the essay on what it felt like being there first. These two picturesque landscapes are also war rehearsal sites. I naively come here in search of solace and revelation. How are militarized landscapes made and sustained? What I find instead is time that ruptures, that war is and isn't now, here, all over, above and under this supposedly still landscape, down in every gorse prickle. I will be plucking them from my palms soon, but I don't know it yet. Or maybe I've plucked them out a long time ago, and I can't quite remember. An air raid alert notification on my phone disrupts the silence with a buzz. Nothing serendipitous. These come several times a day, so there was always a high probability of getting one during the hours I spent on the hill. And the alert presents no danger to me here, but to my loved ones over there. The time is split, and I'm always here, wherever this is, and there, checking who and what has been hit. The catastrophe is not a dark cloud looming on the horizon anymore. It happened on the 24th of February 2022 when Russia started its full-scale war against Ukraine and keeps on happening. This landscape is swollen with the other one. My gaze traces the barbed wire fence, but I'm not sure how to photograph this swell. Part of the problem is that I'm trying to make an impossible photograph of something that appears not to be here. So in the essay, I draw on Glissant's poetic of relations to theorize a little bit the sense of ruptured time and place, as I'm, of course, not the first or the only one to experience such a rupture and attempting to articulate it, and with it also the sense that locating war takes looking in strange places. The photographs that I end up producing are a mix of landscape-wide exposures, like this one over here, trying to fit the entire polygon or the military premises into the frame, and also close-up shots of the plants that grow here. Some of these are gorse bushes, flowering in sync with the warming temperatures, blurring the lines between the seasons. Some of them are pine trees, many of which broken and uprooted during Babet, which was the most severe storm that hit in Scotland in 2023, resulting in human and more than human casualties, and several of them lethal. Other trees that I failed to identify, grassland that on close inspection turns out to be mossland. I'm here to make a more whole image of a militarized landscape and to comprehend a militarization of landscape as such, and to connect the photographs to the land they hold the visual memories of. And because I was especially interested in bringing my photographic practice to the ecologies and to the land that it's embedded with, what I've done while I went to these two sites is that I actually collected some of the plants in both of the locations. And these were heather, chestnut, oak tree, moss, and some grasses. The reason I gathered these was so that I could use them in the darkroom to make image developer to use to develop the photographs I made in there, because I don't know how many of you have experience of working in the darkroom, but plants are incredible like that you can make photographic developers with. But I was stuck because once I got to the darkroom, it seemed like orchestrating a somewhat questionable form of vegetable cannibalism of sorts, feeding the plants I photographed to develop the images of themselves. We will come back to this in a moment. I'm just going to show you a couple of more images. They've all turned out quite dark, which is very resonant with the overall mood of this work. So, okay, how does geranium come into this? I was stuck with not knowing how to use these plants until whilst I was doing the research in parallel on war impacts on the environments in Ukraine and trying to understand how others have also approached looking at the environments that it takes to sustain war, I came across sorry, a photograph of a UAV Shahid drone that Russia uses in Ukraine to target homes and infrastructure. And its molten and fiberglass wing read Geranium-2. It's just a photo as was taken from the screenshot. It's upside down, but you can see it says Geranium-2, or in Ukrainian, in Russian, Herань-2. And I thought, hold on a second, how did we end up in a situation where we have both Geranium, the plant, and Geranium, the drone? And it felt like, of course, an absurd question to ask. And I started digging more into the history of these. And I gave my father a call, who served in the military still in the Soviet times. And he instantly, I'm sure it probably will be not a surprise to many of you here, he instantly was able to come up with several other plant names, such as hyacinths, chrysanthemums, peonies, tulips, carnation, cornflowers, all of these blossoming plants with a deathly weapon counterpart in Russia's arsenal. So all of these have some kind of gun, tank, missile named after the plant. There are some women's names and trees as well, but it's predominantly blossoming plants. And also, as I was writing this, Israel's military AI used to target Palestinians in their homes came out that its name was lavender, or is, that they're still using it. I started tracing geranium as a plant, which led me to looking at the complex history of extraction and biopiracy, because it was Dutch East India Company, known as VOC, that brought it to Europe from South Africa on a ship full of other colonial treasures. And the plant went from a medicinal one for the native people in South Africa to a staple all over Europe, to one of the pharmaceuticals, European ones, eventually trademarking it. And tracing geranium as a drone also led me down these complex colonial imperial connections. So the drones are manufactured currently by Iran, who then sells them to Russia, who then renames them and launches them in Ukraine. The majority of the components are American. And Russia is using crude oil exports as a key source of funding for this war, and also the previous wars in Chechnya, in Georgia. But the big chunk of the incomes from that are currently going to building a factory, a big production facility in Alabuga or Yelabuga, where they are planning to mass produce these drones by next year. But sorry. Yeah, going back to the materials and the darkroom, I will read you another short essay excerpt to tell you what learning about all of this, tracing the materialities between both of the geraniums were, that led me practically, but also symbolically. In one of the versions of the Greek Lernaean Hydra myth, Hercules manages to kill the many-headed Hydra only after having dipped his arrow into Hydra's own poisonous blood. Turning a thing against itself, I finally knew what I needed to do with the heather, moss, and chestnut and oak leaves from the places I photographed. I add the fallen geranium petals from my windowsill into the mix to conclude the loop, deploying geranium as a plant to prevent the swelling of what geranium as a drone stands for, the war that is and isn't there. I brewed an emulsion with all of the plants overnight, took it to the darkroom, and developed the images of the places I photographed in it to prevent the geranium from falling and landing elsewhere. A spell to prevent this land and the land elsewhere from swelling with war. And this is one of the images that I developed using the actual emulsions together with my own geranium petals and all of those plants that I have gathered. There is various bits in the essay that I'm writing about where this led me to, and I just wanted to share a couple of reflections on what thinking closely with the plants and the sites I went to drew my attention in thinking about what it takes to produce war, what it takes to sustain the militarization and warizations. The first one is less of an answer, more of a question, is how do we resist further militarization of landscapes, but in a way that does not deny the possibility for the oppressed and fighting against fascism to defend themselves? So some of these sites that I went to, but also other UK Ministry of Defense sites, are ones where Ukrainian soldiers have been coming since the beginning of the full-scale war to practice safe bomb disposal. But some of these sites are complicit in UK arming Israel's genocide against Palestine. How do we discern and comprehend these interdependencies without just thinking, well, isn't this all so interconnected? But how do we tell the good from bad? The second is that the concept of militarized landscape gradually lost any meaning for me in this process. Because I wondered if the graveyard with those who died in the war, military or civilians, does that count? Is the whole Ukrainian territory now one militarized landscape? Is Gaza? Do the remote places where arms manufacturers allocated count? Do their headquarters on the streets of London, Vienna, or New York count? And does a commercially grown Sitka spruce woodland, whose timber is used for construction on NATO sites or other state military training sites, count? And the third point is that in tracing the geraniums and attempting to comprehend the militarized landscapes, I mainly went outside, but it turned out that they were in my body and in my language all along, and this place where geranium shapeshifts from plant to its weapon counterpart. And it made me ask, what would it take to demilitarize not only landscapes, but our bodies too? And I will just conclude with reading a couple of more sentences from the essay, just the last paragraph in there. With my spell and my photographs, I try to hold the fragments of the story together. A geranium, a fall, a landing, and elsewhere. Everything is heavy if you hold it long enough, says a friend. But there's nowhere else to put it, other than in my hands, in my words, and in my images. I'll be here, writing a political ecology of things that bloom and things that murder, refusing to speak about the war without speaking about flowers, refusing to see this war in disconnect from all other wars and from that gorse bush up on the hill. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina, so much. So many thoughts now in my head based on your presentation. Okay, we will talk about it later. And now the turn is for Hrvoje Petric. Please, the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. I see the map of Croatia.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. I will give you some information about war and environment in Croatia in the beginning of the 1990s. After the war in Gulf in spring of 1991 and the war in Croatia in the second half of the same year, war and ecology as related words that are in principle mutual exclusive will surely enter in the lexicon of ecological terms. During the war in Kuwait, the aggressor threatened an ecological disaster. It tried out this threat, and by releasing oil into the Gulf and setting oil sources on fire, and he tried to disable the enemy, disrupt water transport and the operation of aviation. Denounced ecological disaster of huge proportion was subordinated to the immediate effects, peripheral war victories, and postponing the defeat by just a few days. But in Croatia was situation big difficult. It will be difficult to find an answer to a question of what kind of tactical war plan is hidden behind the destruction of national parks on Croatia. The national park is with the national and nature park is on the map with green colors, and all of a national park here is attacked in war. The Plitvice Lake, Krka River, Kornati, and Plenica in the Velebit area. Natural parks, Lonjsko Polje Hill, and Kopački Rit. Countless parks and city parks. Arboretum, one of the oldest in Europe from 15th century, Trsteno. In addition to damage to buildings and heritage of national and international value, the aggressor's destruction also affects the ecological balance of narrower and wider localities, which directly affects himself. During the war in Slovenia, in Croatian neighborhood, June 1991, planes of the aggressor army flew over the nuclear power plant Krško. This is the near Croatian and in Slovenia near the Croatian border, here on the Sava River. There is this place, exactly. And crashed over it, threatening its destruction. It's known that the destruction of such an object would create environmental hazard, not only for immediately surroundings, but also for a wide area. Of course, the area would suffer, but so would the people of aggressor, as well as the children or the closest family of those who issues of carried out such of an order. An illustrative example of the connection between war destruction and negative environmental consequence is the Sava River. This is the Sava River, this is the line, Sava River. Are you see? Yeah, okay. In its entire basin, the aggressors destroyed numerous residential and commercial buildings, with a large amount of chemicals and oil production ending up in the river water. Thus, in 12 attacks from September to November 1991, the oil refinery in Sisak caused great destruction, fires, and the leakage more of the 18,000 tons of oil and oil products into Sava River. A continuous oil slick moved downstream from the Sava and after 15 days appeared at the confluence of the Sava and the Danube, today in Serbia. Considering the behavior of hydrocarbons in water, the consequence of this pollution can be long-lasting, except for the damage that directly affect to disturbances of the sensitive river ecosystem. The water of the Sava and Danube rivers will not be able to be used for supplying the industry for a long time without additional processing. However, the danger to the ecosystem of the Sava and Danube rivers became greater as the aggressions against industrial facility continued and the destroyed facilities without additional intervention represented a constant danger. During the attack and destruction of the Sisak area and refinery installation, sewage network, retention basins, and wastewater treatment devices were damaged. During the war in Croatia, the aggressors' forces tried to demolish the dam of Peruća. This is the Peruća area, it's in the southern part of Croatia. And during the highest water level ever measured, but the specific construction of the dam, long core, and the quick intervention of the Croatian army, the flooding of the downstream villages and the loss of human and animal lives were prevented. In addition, the aggressors deliberately destroyed tens of thousands of tons of explosive in the areas they were living, Rijeka, Ogulin, Karlovac, Bjelovar, and etc. In the places of the former war houses, huge craters and significantly changing landscape remain. Numerous plant and animal species were destroyed, residential and commercial buildings were damaged, and the environment was contaminated. The construction, disabling and the left and of environmental protection equipment and devices, wastewater treatment devices, filters, and etc., resulted in further negative immediate and long-term impacts of the environment in the Republic of Croatia. War damage and endangerment of the environment in the Republic of Croatia was also caused by uncontrolled release of effluents from industrial, communal, and energy systems, difficulties in removal and disposal of total waste material due to war action, endangerment, the construction on equipment or equipment for garbage removal, and occupation of areas with landfills. There is some picture from that area. The creation of large quantities of the waste with undetermined location types, quantities, and direct and indirect consequence and long-term environmental and public health consequence. The destruction of war test and equipment, aircrafts, ships, tanks, vehicles, tools with uncontrolled release and of dangerous substances into the environment. By deliberating thinking military equipment and weapons in the sea, for example, near Pula area. Here is one mine in Adriatic Sea, and the large forest fires with destruction of oxygen production and release of dioxygens, increased soil erosions and aesthetic pollution and destruction of the landscape. Contamination of drinking water, then food, air, and object of general use. By destroying resource food production and storage, increased frequency of zoonoses and so on, explosive spreads of rats, mice, flies, and other pests and parasites. And with problem of waste disposal from donation in war, medicines, expired food, items of general use, and clothing. And on the end, residual mines and explosive and problem surrounding reforestation due to residual mines, which in the dynamic karst caused erosion of fertile soil and denudation of these areas along with change in the microclimate. Instead of our conclusion, we can say that the war destruction in the Republic of Croatia caused numerous immediate and long-term negative consequences for the environment and character of living for today. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Koya. Okay, dear speakers, thank you for your talks. Dear guests, you have now the opportunity to ask questions. Ask please in the chat if you have something in your mind. While you're thinking and typing in our chat, I would like to ask you a question. It's rather general one, but based on the talk of Adriana Ivahiu. You said about environmental turn in humanities, but can we? Is it right to explore so massively environment now during the ongoing war, or should we leave it until the war ends? I mean, especially when we are talking about environmental history, not humanities. Can we do that now, or should we wait until, I don't know, several decades, for example? Can we be objective? And can we see the bigger picture now? And I think this question is for everybody. Please, could you please reflect on that?
Well, I'll take the question first. I do think that we can think about the bigger picture within which this war is taking place. Even as we need to attend to the war, we have to do what we can. Obviously, it's an urgent daily phenomenon. But at the same time, I do think that we can think about its significance, not just on a daily basis, but also as a point in history, in human history, that we are part of. And so it connects Ukrainians to others around the world. And that's how we can communicate better about the war. You asked, can we think about environment and can we think about history? Yes, I think the war is an environmental war. It's a historical war. There's no way to disentangle these things. I think as Irina showed, even plants and militarism are entangled, and it may seem like a distraction to think about the naming of weapons or think about plants right now, but I think that that's what lends our everyday experience that much more meaning. So in a sense, my answer is that this broad, connective, humanistic way of thinking about war makes sense of it for us and makes sense of why it's important for us to speak and to act as we do.
I'm happy to jump in with a comment there. Yeah, the short answer is, in my view, it's extremely unwise not to think about the environment now. And the longer answers that I suppose that question that I hear being asked, oh, can we really think about these plants when there's people dying? The same dynamics plays out in any climate change conversation, not any, but some climate change conversation, where the question is, oh, how can we think about climate change when people can't afford to eat or can't afford things? And that creates a very artificial false divide between the issues, where we see the environment as that thing over there, like that tree over there is environment, but I am not environment, I'm a person. And if we are, if we do the work, which I think there's a lot of amazing stuff within environmental history and environmental humanities in trying to deconstruct that dichotomy and learn to think about ourselves as part of all of these living webs of life that are being destroyed by the war, by imperialism, colonialisms, and how do we defend life against all of this death and oppression. And it's about reframing that conversation on the terms of life rather than having people who would happily frame everything in economic terms, that economy is important to talk about and environment is not. It's a very backward perception of what it takes to sustain life.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, Hawaiian, do you have something to tell us? But please unmute.
I
Okay.
think that it's the Adrian and Irina said all important.
Okay, I have a question for you. For example, we are now talking about ongoing war, but a war in Croatia is already ended. So, how do you think, based on your experience, how was it to start explore the impacts of the war on environment during the war, after the war, or now? What was the challenges? What was better for field?
For thinking about environment in war in Croatia, this is really different. There is in war in nowadays, because it's the techniques and thinkings about war in 1991 is really different. There is possible to connect with Middle East wars in 1990s, but not with war in 21st century. But in war in Croatia, you have two phases. One phase is 1991. This is the beginning of war, and there was a main destroying activities against the nature and people. And another phases after that, from 1992 to 1995. And in that period was problem because that 1/3 of Croatian territory was an occupation, and the occupation government don't have any restriction against people in activities in nature. For example, in free part of Croatia, you have very, very slowly established European laws and thinking about environments from the Western Europe. But in occupied part of Croatia, this is the 1/3 of territory, there is no law. And there is everybody doing what you want. There is a lot of deforestation, illegal deforestation. Only occupation was a few national park. There is a great damage in that period. And after liberation, Croatia must restoring a lot of things. And another problem after war was that very a long area and wide area in ex-occupied territory was with problem of moving of people. Some people leave the places and some new people came in that places. But generally, after 30 years, a lot of ex-war area was depopulated. And another thing is that after where don't have people there is possible to see a lot of environmental changes. And one positive thing is that is in some area is nature come back in fields and you find some old species which is disappeared before war, and they back in that area. But there is very difficult to say that in some areas for the nature is good, because it's very sad story on the beginning of that. I think I tried to for this presentation and try to find the examples in Bosnia and Herzegovina, who is neighbor country in Croatia and very connected in war. But there is not enough time for that. But sometimes, in 1991, you have war in Croatia, but not in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And some animals migrated from Croatia to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in 1992 to 1995 was a very strong war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And some animals moved from that area in a neighboring country. And you have but there is very small sources about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
because one thing is the bear migration and I think wolf migration. Another thing is the birds. Who is controlling the birds, and there is not possible to find the information. You have information from 1980s, before war, 1980 and 1970s, and you have information in 21st century. There's some comparison is possible for that. But another things in war is not only military activities. You have in war period problem with pollution, and this is I think that is one of the main problem of the border area is mine pollution with mine, because it's today's a lot of work with the replace the mines from the soils, but today's around 71 square kilometers contaminated area. This is the relatively small area, but the local people is sometimes have problem with mines. But you have significance for that. But there is the problem because sometimes the animals will go in minefields and have the problems and dies.
Yeah, of course, this is devastating. But as you were saying about animals crossing the borders during the war, the good thing about environment and research in environment is to understand that there is no borders, any borders for plants, for birds, for animals, etc. Thank you so much for your reflection. Just one more additional question about the researchers. You as an environmental historian, did you notice some kind of arising the interest in environmental research after the war? Or no, was there any connection between war, environment, and research?
In Croatia, we have a lot of research about war, but I'm not sure that is environment historians and environmental historians doing research about environmental wars. But you have a lot of documents in archives and in elaborate newspapers, and you have witnesses of the biologists, the hunters, and another. And I think that is a very good opportunity for new research. if you connect the war and environmental history in 1991 to 1995 in Croatia. But not only in Croatia, that is possible to especially doing research in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you. What I'm trying to understand here is why, for example, now when the war in Ukraine started, this environmental turn became possible. Why environmental issues became so important to researchers? Maybe Adrian and Irina, you can reflect on that.
But one sentence. The situation with environmental thinking in world is in 2022 to 24 is really different than situation in late 1980s and late 1990s. And today's easier to think about that in war situation. In that period when was war in Croatia, there was very marginal themes. Today's a different situation, and Adrian said give us a very broad picture, and I think that is no time to lose for environmental historians, and there is you have good opportunity to doing with war now. Why not?
Would you like to respond, Adrian, Irina? Unmute yourself, please.
Yes, I think the environmental turn is it's not just Ukrainian. It's a worldwide thing, and just because people's awareness of climate change and environmental issues more generally has become so obvious, so much present, at least within the intellectual classes, educated people. The war has, for Ukrainians, made the connection between war and environment more obvious than it is for many people. But I think obviously Ukraine is not the only place where that connection is clear. We've heard about Croatia, but also Gaza and all around the world. So I don't think that the environmental turn wouldn't have happened for Ukrainian scholars, but it's just much more essential now, and you can't ignore it in a sense as easily as Ukrainian institutions for the most part did ignore it for many years.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a matter of also is it those who are already engaged in the topic having much more space and opportunities to express themselves, or is it the new people turning to that? I don't know. I think in the arts that has been thinking in this complex overlaps of environmental, social, political crisis that has like a much longer tradition. And there's various there's a whole strand of like artist / researcher, like in many ways, maybe a problematic practice, which I'm also definitely complicit in, where you kind of with one foot you're standing in the research, in another you're in the art, and you are neither, but you're in both. And then you're trying to articulate all of these major issues that don't fit anywhere disciplinary. I think earlier there was much more of a challenge where, okay, I see all of these connections in these issues, and then where do you fit? Like I studied, for example, in the main environmental university of Ukraine, and there was close to nothing about people in there. We had to think about plants. Plants was the only thing, and absolutely not, no politics, no philosophy. No, that does not belong there. And I think it's kind of more erupting out of these spaces that are truly interdisciplinary, where we can't box things into their own separate boxes, because the real world is not like that. I think there's much more acknowledgement that we can't afford to continue kind of seeing things separately, because they're not.
Okay, thank you so much. Now we have some questions in the chat. Guido Hausman asks, how is the information situation in Ukraine about the effects of environmental warfare? Are scientists heard in the media on the local, regional, and national level?
I could say a few words maybe to that. I don't think the question is addressed to anyone in particular, is it? Yeah, I think so. There's the incredible team behind the Ukrainian Nature Conservation Group, also UNCG, who are doing incredible, like, lobbying, information campaigns, involved in like so many international projects that are trying to keep track of the war damage. There is Ecodozor tracker of like the environmental crimes as well. But as you can imagine, there's no comprehensive systematic assessments of the damage. So all the numbers that we hear coming out now, that those are partial assessments of things. I wouldn't be able to claim that, yes, scientists are definitely being heard, but there's definitely a lot of production of these assessments, of paying attention of what is happening. And I want to also to give a shout out to the forthcoming book of a very dear friend of mine, an incredible scholar, Daria Cymbaluk. So she is currently finishing the book on ecocide in Ukraine, the environmental cost of Russian war, and it will be published next year. So there's a lot of she's writing about that more from environmental humanities, I suppose, perspective, but there are so many like ecologists that are involved in the very kind of hardcore data gathering and those things.
Okay, thank you, Rina.
For joining us for the last seminar in the Ukrainian
Okay,
environmental.
we now have another question in the chat. It's from Katerina Rudenko, who is a scholar from Dalhousie, I would say, funded by Research Nova Scotia to conduct autoethnography and story sharing about the landscapes of a lost home, as they belong to the memory and imagination of Ukrainian person forced to flee abroad. And she would like to ask a question about the prospects of Ukrainian environmental humanities. Katerina says that there is no academic community, association, or groups to exchange academic and artistic inquiry on Ukrainian environmental humanities globally or in Canada. I would say I don't agree with this statement, but let's say the other part of the question. Due to the respect I feel I have to pay to the unceded land where I reside and staying loyal to the values of my research, I participate in many fruitful interdisciplinary discussions, but turn out to be the only person raising the specific question we are discussing right now. Overall, Katerina says that she feels lonely. Please don't. We are here to discuss all those questions. So are there any groups or association in the process of being formed? Any ways to connect to people who do research in Ukrainian environmental humanities? So I would like to say that there are a lot of different groups who are doing this environmental research. I want to tell only about environmental history, and I would like Irina to say about environmental humanities, for example. For now, first of all, there is an European Society for Environmental History. We have a regional representative there of Ukraine. Also, we created environmental history research group. This is a research group, which is the main idea is to gather different historians in environmental history who do this environmental research. And our initial idea was to create this environment where everybody can share about environmental history. So for now, for example, we will have the conference in Sofia, Bulgaria this month in 2 weeks, I guess, and we gather a lot of prominent environmental historians who will talk about different, absolutely different angles of environmental history. I mean, from the rivers until the connection of war and environment now. And also we are planning to publish the edited volume on environmental history of Ukraine, because as you know, there are very few publications on this topic. So please join us, find me in Facebook, for example, and we can be friends and not not to feel so lonely in our research field. Okay, Irina, would you like to say something?
Yes, and can I just say also that I feel like Anna Bean is also extremely modest, but Anna is one of like the people of the Ukrainian environmental history. And for me personally, of Ukraine, it's been such a major wow aha moment discovering the article that you wrote about Ukrainian steppes and how when Russian Empire was expanding, how down south it was shaping all of the environments. And it's kind of, there is a tradition, but you need to, I guess, to be connected to specific people to be able to see that. And on the environmental humanities, yeah, I see Adrian already shared in the chat that there is the Ukrainian Environmental Humanities Network. I wanted to mention that as well, but it's later, hopefully this autumn, there will be a special issue coming out in the East-West Journal of Ukrainian Studies that is focused on what is this whole environmental humanities thing in Ukraine and how it came about. And that was put together by Daria Tsimbaluk, who I mentioned in my earlier comment, together with professor in anthropology Tanya Richardson, who also has been working with Ukrainian places, environments for a very, very long time. I will have one of my essays as a part of that as well, and I think there are also other thinkers. But it's that volume that Tanya and Daria bringing that together, I think that has been very significant. It didn't come out yet, but it already felt like them doing this very important work of trying to bring us as people connected to the topic together and think about it, because you're right, it can feel very, very, very lonely, especially if you're not like formally in academia or yeah, just generally. So yeah, come and the Environmental Humanities Network is, so it's Ukrainian based one, and yeah, they're doing like kind of, yeah, that came off on the back of organizing this special issue by Tanya and Daria. They're not directly involved. It's run by brilliant people, mainly in Kiev. I'm gonna not name all of the names because there's 5 of them and I'm definitely gonna forget someone, but yeah, do look them up. They are currently working on a new volume of the Solomia magazine, which is an incredible Ukrainian print magazine, and it will be focused on environmental humanities broadly issues. So yeah, do have a look at that. I think I'm going to be talking for a while about that, but maybe I'll just mention that there is a big challenge with terminology, and I think Anna, you could probably relate to this, that it's we find ourselves, most of us who are doing this work are often a lot present in Western English-speaking context, and we lack language to speak about this in Ukrainian, and we need to work out some lexicon to be able to articulate all of this in Ukrainian rather than translating things. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Irina. I think Daria Tsimbaluk and Tanya Richardson will publish some thoughts on that, how to translate environmental humanities, how to translate and adopt in Ukraine environmental history, for example. So I hope that sometime we will have the opportunity to use the only terminology, the only one terminology for that, to define environmental research. Okay, thank you so much. So, Katrina, I see that you are satisfied by our answers. Okay, if you have some other questions, please write in the chat. And while we have just 5 minutes until our seminar ends, I would like to ask one more question. Please be short. We are talking about decolonization very often lately. In several words, please describe what you as a scholar could do to decolonize this narrative in environmental studies. like to start?
Just a clarifying question. Is the question to decolonize the dominant narrative of environmental studies, or is it something else?
No, I mean that environmental studies are in the shadow of different other narratives, for example, Russian narratives, and how Russian historiography sees environmental history, for example. What would you do to decolonize this dominant narrative?
Hmm.
Or maybe you disagree.
Well, I mean, it's one question to decolonize the Russian narrative about anything, about history, about environment, and so on. It's another thing to decolonize generally mainstream narratives about the environment. And I think the field of environmental studies, which that's what my PhD was in, has required decolonization for a few decades. I think the field really emerged in at the end of the 1960s, 1970s with environmental history and other sorts of environmental anthropology and other subfields emerging. But that decolonization, I would say, has been happening in the sense that questioning colonial assumptions has been happening for maybe 20 years now or something by many people within the field. But again, I'm not sure if the question concerns environmental studies, if it concerns environment and dominant conceptions of environment, or something more specific.
Okay, thank you. Let's leave like that. Your answer. Yeah. Irina, would you like to respond on that?
It's very banal for me in a way, but it's continuing to unapologetically write about plants and through them speak about all of this big mess that we are stuck in without simplifying it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think the time is out. Thank you so much for your great talks today. Thank you so much for a lot of different new angles, a lot of different new ideas, which I guess and I hope that our attendees took from your talks. Thank you so much. It was I was very happy to have you during this seminar, and I hope that this is just the first one and we will meet somewhere soon at the conferences, book chapters, etc. So thank you so much. Sorry, something is in. Okay, Irina said that Rhoya maybe wanted to say something about decolonization. Rhoya?
I think the decolonization in thinking of environmental history is different than in position of Ukraine than in position of Croatia. I think that decolonization is helping for push the fields of environmental history, of appreciation of the multiple ways how humans and non-humans relate. I think that is one of the first thing for researching, and another thing is different and not time for discussion about that.
Thank you. Does someone want to say something else? No, we are good. Okay. Thank you so much, dear colleagues, for presenting today. And I hope we will see, as I said already, somewhere soon. Thank you so much. And dear guests, I think this recording will be published soon on the YouTube channel of German Ukrainian Commission. So thank you so much.